So, you spend a lot of time playing jazz from what we might say jazz from the 20s and 30s, early jazz swing, and you're sort of known for that. So tell me what it is about that music that you love so much, or tell me what it is about later music that perhaps you don't like so much.
Well, I guess I can explain how I got into it. I used to find playing. I remember the fear of a jam session. I was learning to play jazz, and I'd go and we'd have to play these standards. We'd play these tunes, and we'd all be playing this tune together. But I'd be trying to play it, and I couldn't understand at all what was going on with all these strange chords, with all these notes in them, and all these. Everybody seemed to be trying to confuse each other. That's what it felt like to me. I spent all these years trying to understand this kind of. Somehow I thought that one day it was going to click.
Yeah.
There's these kind of clashy sounds, and we have to kind of show off our ability to play things that are quite obtuse and strange, and have to learn these very specific licks and all this stuff like that. And I remember when I discovered the older music. I was at music college, and we did a course in the old 20s jazz, and I discovered Sidney Bechet, the great clarinetist and saxophone player. And I remember I think the first thing I heard was a record of him playing Summertime, and I remember just hearing it, and it just completely mesmerizing. It just mesmerized me because this note came in, this sound, and it was just such an unexpected sound, so much clarity and simplicity at the same time as a real depth. There was a feeling of a memory of something. Maybe it was a connection back to something I'd grown up with my whole life. My parents are very into classical music, but something else as well. I think, and then I started playing the music, and going back to that idea about the jam session thing, it was like, suddenly, I was playing along to guitarists playing chords with 3 notes in them on every beat.
Yeah.
Here was the pulse. Here's your chords.
Mm-hmm.
No one seems to be trying to confuse anyone. The bass notes are always the bass notes of the chords and the simple things. And so that was kind of like the experience of playing it for me.
So is it something about the simplicity of and the directness,
yes,
and the way of expressing something very complex, which is very nuanced but ends up sounding incredibly simple and direct rather than the opposite, which is sometimes quite annoying when something is actually really simple but sounds really complicated.
I think, sometimes it seems in modern jazz like it's kind of a game to kind of show off how intellectual you are. But actually, when you look at the substance behind all of that, it's not as intellectual as you thought it was. And a discovery that actually the pursuit of making a sound communicate a very, very specific feeling with the craft of sculpting notes is actually just as intense a pursuit as the art of learning how to play a lot of notes or
coming up with content, right? It's like, so I guess that was maybe a thing that happened in jazz, maybe with Lenny Tristano, or who knows exactly where it happened, but this idea of like content being the main thing rather than how you say something and the nuance with which you say it.
That's one element, but I think the most important element the other important element which should really be put forward is that at the time when I discovered this music, I was actually quite conflicted in my taste. I'd learned classical clarinet. I was learning jazz. I discovered very early on that I loved to improvise. I remember being 13. I discovered Miles Davis, and I was like, I was 12 when I started learning jazz, and by the time I was 13, I was like, improvising is my favourite thing to do. I'm going to be a jazz musician for the rest of my life. I knew that was my career path. And then, over the years, before going to study, I started getting into other sorts of music that was for dancing to. I remember getting really obsessed with Fela Kuti at some point, around the time I was like 16. African and a lot of African music and stuff, and I really loved being in situations in a party atmosphere when people were dancing, and that was something that here I was. I played classical music. I was studying jazz, which was very serious. Everyone, the concert experience is everyone sitting down and kind of, close-faced,
a bit like this interview.
A bit like this interview, exactly. A bit like what I'm doing here, and then and I really loved just having fun. I used to take my saxophone to all the festivals. All my friends, whenever they were at a party, while they were all getting drunk, when they were like 17, 18, I always had a saxophone on me and I was always playing.
For hours and hours, I bet. Yeah.
And I just play with whatever music was around. It was electronic dance music, all that stuff. And when I found jazz, when I found the old style jazz, first of all through Sidney Bechet, suddenly I was like, wow, this encapsulates everything that I love. It's music for dancing to. It has these beautiful classical sensibilities, and it's all about improvisation. And suddenly it was like everything came together. So
tell me, Sidney Bechet, tell me about Lester Young as well, because Lester is also my absolutely all-time favourite saxophone player, and I know he probably is yours too. So tell me what's so special about Lester
as
Young.
I've said, I hold Sidney Bechet and Lester Young as my two favourite players. I like to think of Sidney Bechet like the sun, because he's very, very, that fast vibrato and that very forthright. I must say, when I first heard him, it made me want to do this all the time. It's like I was so used to this idea of jazz being cool and mellow. Yeah. And suddenly there was someone going like, and then Lester Young is like the moon, and he is obviously the originator of cool in jazz, of mellow. Yeah. But it's funny that they should seem like such opposites, but actually, in fact, they are of a very similar ilk, mainly because of their ability to make their instruments talk. The way of I don't know. It's hard to explain exactly. It's a strong sense of sound. It's an ability to sculpt notes, but it's also about phrasing. It's kind of mainly about phrasing, I guess.
So let's talk about phrasing and how you play melodies, how you play simple things in a very, very, very kind of focused, detailed, nuanced way through ornamentation and through. Well, you tell me the things that you really value, because like the way you play melodies. Most people don't. That it's sort of a lost art of melody. For example, when I was at music college, we never got taught how to play melodies, how to sing melodies. We got taught so many things, but that wasn't one of them. And that's one of the things I love about your playing. And most sax players don't really use vibrato. They don't really slide between notes. They don't do all these things. They don't use expressive intonation. So tell me about those things and why you value them.
It's a very meditative part of my practice, actually. When I learn a melody, I will play it in all 12 keys on my instrument. One thing I really like to do is on the clarinet, I find the lowest point that the melody fits on my instrument, and I just go up chromatically. So it's not even just doing it in 12 keys, it's just going up.
Yeah.
And you'd think that would be really boring. Why would you just play a melody? But every time I'm trying to find all the ways that I can connect between the notes, that I can take away this whole thing. You look at the clarinet and it's like, here's this note, here's this note, here's note, and I'm trying to get rid of all of that.
Yeah.
And bring it back to the voice. I actually always wanted to be a cello player. I always wanted to be a cellist when I was a kid, or at least that's how I remember it. And I wound up playing the clarinet. And actually, it's the thing that I find really exciting is the romantic violin and cello styles that still exist in classical music today have taught me a lot, and the way they imitate the voice. So I use the terminology associated with them. Portamento is one of my main focuses, and it's really. I suppose I could start demonstrating these different things.
Yeah, sure.
So I guess it's always difficult to pick a tune, but
you just show us the specific things.
Well, the basic thing is that I can connect two notes together, so.
Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, I guess people are used to the idea of glissando on the clarinet as being the beginning of Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah.
But actually, I can do it between any note. It's kind of like, how would I sing this thing?
So it's very much connected to singing, isn't it? Really, like, I'm sure it is, because because all those things are things that singers have to do in order to connect two notes in a smooth way. You have to slide to a certain degree, right?
So basically there's several parts to this. So yes, that's definitely one of the exercises that I'll do. I mean, sometimes that's just simply what I'm doing. I want to try and connect every single note of a melody, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it can sound very ridiculous.
Sure.
I mean, that's the art of it. It's like, it's so, you have to be so careful to make it do the thing right. If you bend it too much in certain ways, it can sound like clown music. It's the ability to kind of make it mean something.
Sure.
So that's one of the things. The other thing is kind of like, it's not about connecting two notes, but intentionally playing with the intonation of a note. So sometimes it's just the simple idea of starting a note flat. That's something that really blew my mind with Sidney Bechet. Is that he would sometimes at the end of a piece, he'll hold a note for a really long time without vibrato, flat,
right,
and then just bring it into tune just at the end to build up this tension. So I don't know if that was the right note to do.
No, we understood. So okay, so this is like this thing, microtonality. Okay, so tell me about that and how you use that in your playing. Why do you think more like, I hate to use this word, but more modern styles of saxophone play or modern jazz, they kind of reject these ornaments and these ways, these expressive techniques. I mean, firstly, is why do you think that is? Like, why do people not slide? Why do people use vibrato? Is it something about the instruments, or is it something about cool?
I don't know. That's something that's kind of always confused me a little bit. But I don't know. I mean, I have to remember that I got into Miles Davis first. But then again, I guess he stands out because he is making lots of different noises. I don't know if it's always intentional.
But it's always great.
Not always.
Oh,
I mean, I think he's a very variable player. I've grown over the years to prefer players that I feel are quite consistent. I think it reflects my perfectionism, and so that's what I mean. That's what really stands out. I know we were talking about Lester Young, but Sidney Bechet stands out because he is so precise and it's so well crafted. I mean, Lester Young is like that at his best, but obviously he had terrible problems with alcohol and stuff later in his life, so you get to hear some quite guttural and quite raw stuff from him. But actually, having said that, that's almost what stands out of him, which I love. It's more intimate. It is the most intimate saxophone sound. There is a fragility that runs through it.
Tell me just because Lester Young, lots of people love Lester Young, but I wouldn't say he's like everyone's favourite sax player necessarily. What is it about him one thing about him that you just think is incredible?
Well, okay, another thing I can say about being a saxophonist is that throughout my life, I mean, I often felt a bit embarrassed that I was a saxophonist. I guess I was born in the 80s, and that was the back end of the saxophone had been present throughout popular music since the dawn of popular music. And in the 80s, it got to such an extreme in its style that no one wanted to hear it ever again. Yeah. And we've basically, it's beginning to creep back into pop music every now and again. There's that guy who plays the baritone sax with the pink hair. You're starting to hear it in pop music again. But the 80s basically scared everyone off the saxophone. Okay. So I grew up in the wake of that. Yeah. And so people think of the saxophone as this very brash, obnoxious, like over-sexualized sound. Yeah. Sleazy, pornographic. And when you hear Lester Young, I've often said to people, if you don't like the saxophone, listen to Lester Young, because basically he doesn't make it sound like a saxophone. Yeah. I mean, I think that's almost like the best musicians of all instruments. They take it beyond the instrument. The instrument ceases to exist. It becomes a voice. That's what it is for me. Okay. I mean, that's what I'm searching for. I'm guessing that's what we're all searching for with the instruments, is to transcend the instrument itself. And Lester Young is a master of that. In fact, if you hear him play the clarinet, he just sounds like Lester Young. He doesn't sound like any other clarinet player. Yeah. He doesn't really sound like a clarinet. But specifically on the saxophone, that he does it by basically the saxophone you know, if you think about it as it is before you manipulate the sound, it's basically like, I mean, it is the cross between a clarinet and an oboe or a cor anglais, and if it's played unadulterated, it sounds very reedy.
Yeah.
Right? But Lester Young never plays like that. You know, every now and again you hear a honk.
Yeah.
But otherwise, he's doing this thing called subtone, and he's so effective of it that he does it throughout the whole instrument. There's no, so instead it will sound like this, which is a very soothing sound.
Yeah.
And it's the amazing thing about it is you basically, somehow it's like you're just cutting out all those high frequencies, and it's this warm kind of duvet of a sound, I suppose. But it also like it's able to fill a space and sound massive without whilst still it's this amazing ability for him to sound like he's whispering whilst also being
very
sounding
present.
huge. It's very resonant, but it's like this kind of
totally.
So it's this very kind of smooth.
That's like real presence, isn't it, to be able to do that? And that's one of the things I love about this music as well, like the fact that it's, you know, so simple sometimes and so sweet, you know, and just the sound. Obviously, it's to do with the recording techniques at the time as well, and there's like very much less high frequencies in the recordings. And yeah, well, Lester, I've just got so many great things to say about him. Let's go back and speak about microtonality, because we never got on that. Tell me about how you use like the spaces between.
Well, I mean,
notes.
I guess that thing you say, equally tempered, that's been a mission of mine for quite a long time. Recently, is to come to understand, you know, how we got to equal temperament in the first place by looking at the physics of sound, and you know, it's a complicated thing, but we're talking about frequencies and harmonics and things. And if anyone's studied this stuff, you'll know that equal temperament is basically going against physics.
Yeah.
It's all about compromise. It's not about pure notes. And actually, it's funny because we've been playing Wagner this evening. I don't know did Wagner compose on the piano? Or did he compose in his head?
Imagine so.
Because if he had access to a piano, he wouldn't have had access to equal temperament, which is something that I've started to look into. I mean,
well, he probably would have had access to equal temperament, but he would have had access to other temperaments as well.
No. But equal temperament didn't really come into fruition until the 20th century. Like,
yeah, but it was still around, wasn't it?
They had Young's temperament, so even then, each key had its different place. And anyway, that's a huge subject. But basically, I guess intonation has two. For me, it has two elements, right? You can basically be sitting above the tuning of a note on purpose, playing sharp, which is something. Well, you can't say it's always on purpose, but someone like Lester Young can create a very beautiful effect. Almost kind of, it sounds like there's a kind of constant tear in his eye or something. He's just like that fragile kind of sound of being just slightly sharp all the time. It's very, very, and it, you know, when it's done right, it's very beautiful. In fact, I mean, it does come about in modern jazz. You can hear it in, you know, if you think about Coltrane playing Naima, there's that lovely slightly sharp thing. So that's kind of one side of expressive intonation.
Sleek on it's just like that too.
Yeah, and then it becomes a bit over the top sometimes when people do it really intentionally, like, you know. You know, the saxophone's a very difficult instrument to play, so it does play out of tune anyway.
So what's the second thing?
And then the other thing is about the precise frequencies that are not found on the piano.
Yeah. First
of all, we can think about the ones that exist in classical music. You know, if you were playing in a string quartet in classical music, you would be intentionally using just intonation and Pythagorean tuning. So we can talk about, you know, so the major scale equal tempered sounds one way.
Sure.
I mean, we can demonstrate.
Yeah, let's do that.
So we're talking about very, very subtle things which actually make a really big difference.
Right. So if I play a D.
Yeah, you played.
If I play a D, show us an equally tempered major third.
So on the so on the piano with equal temperament. Something like that.
Yeah. And now now play us a just third.
So if I do it correctly, the just third should kind of disappear into the sound because it actually is completely in sympathy with the note that you play.
And you know instantly that it's right. I mean, it resonates so much more. Just play that. Just play the well-tempered third, and then
But equal tempered, and then
equal tempered, and then slide down to the just one.
Oh, that's a bit difficult. Hopefully.
So a lot of your playing explores the sort of micro details.
Well, yeah, hopefully.
What about blues as well?
I could pretend that some of the notes I played this evening that were intentionally, but sometimes you do just actually play out of tune.
Of course.
It's very difficult.
And tell me about this
Okay,
thing.
so sorry, you were saying.
No. Tell me about this specific thing in something like blues, which is like very much microtonal music.
I've always thought about the blues as a kind of search. It's kind of like, you've reached what I love about the blues, and it's kind of intersection with how the crossing of cultures that is what jazz is. These intersecting of culture, of tradition, and you've had this classical tradition. We've got to the point where it's pretty much exactly bang on the time that we've actually been able to make pure equal temperament for the first time using electronic devices is about the same time that jazz is invented. It's
right.
like literally they come together at the same moment, and music started out with all these lovely pure frequencies, and then we've got to this point where it's almost been forgotten. Then suddenly this blues comes along, this idea called the blues, which is kind of bringing back some ancient past of music, these special notes. And so for me, it's about seeking out a feeling in a place that it's really hard to explain, but you
can demonstrate. If
the
it's
best
easier.
way is if you play a chord, right?
Yeah.
So if you play, probably have to tune up, if you play a C major chord or something.
Yeah.
Well, the piano almost has a just third there right now. Okay, so I would say. So what I do is I play with the notes until they hit certain kind of sweet places, but it's always fleeting with the blues. You don't really kind of linger there because it's almost like if you hold the chord again. So I would say. So we all talk about the third. That's where the feeling is.
Yeah.
I would say in the blues, I mean, we've got several thirds. The third that existed, the straight third, which is often in the accompaniment.
Yeah.
But we don't really use that in the blues. We'll either use a just third, but because it kind of clashes with the accompaniment. It's almost like the truth is clashing with the accompaniment. So you can approach it like. You never linger there long enough, because if you linger there too long, it will kind of clash. It's weird. It's hard to explain, but it's about seeking out these sweet places and kind of moving into them and kind of moving away from them.
Yeah.
But we have that third, which is very much like the just third, and then we have this other third, which is quite strange, which is a minor third. But if you play, even if you play a minor chord right now, I can play the blues by playing my minor third sharper than your third.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is that third can fit over both major and minor. I don't know if we can do the other one. If you play minor and I play the just third, I don't think it's going to work.
If it doesn't stay there too long,
that's
great, right?
So that's definitely a thing about the blues. It's all about that note a lot, but then it's also about this very strange. Playing around the fifth, which I still haven't quite come to understand why. It's mysterious to me. Maybe it's almost better that I don't even try and understand it.
But it's something that you get to by playing the fifth and then going down, right?
Yeah. And of course, when we have the seventh, which is just a mirror of the third.
One of the things that you're really into is freedom within music, freedom within rules, freedom within time, different types of time existing together. So a lot of the music you play is dance music, like it has a regular beat, more or less, and within above that things float and then lock in. So let's talk about that, and let's talk about Billie Holiday and
I guess
other examples that you love.
I guess that's the thing. I think I've always really been really excited about the things in the music which you cannot write down. So we're talking about micro tuning, and now we're talking about micro rhythm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a really beautiful term today, which was about that you got from some. Was it Mozart or?
Yeah. So both Mozart and Chopin, they both refer to this thing called tempo rubato, which is not rubato in the way that most of us understand it, as in like just slowing down and speeding up, robbing time. Rather, it's within a more or less steady accompaniment, a melody floating on top of that. So, which is why Chopin wrote a lot of his music the way it is, distributed between two hands as an attempt to convey that on paper, though people don't really play it that way. It's all, people play it very much kind of lined up and synchronized in general. Obviously, older pianists from like back in the day, they had this skill, which I think has been lost. But in jazz, it's very much not lost, because it was the way these early jazz musicians delivered melodies, right?
Well, there's a very interesting collection of there's a whole set of different ways of playing rhythm that exist in, when you're kind of thinking about and still expressing it as dance music. I guess it is about that. We've got just the concept of swing itself, which is about adding this kind of feeling of a lilt that can be strong, or it can be slight, or it can be very strong, and that's something that we're kind of used to talking about. But then there's something that I find very exciting when I listen to the very, very earliest recordings of a kind of New Orleans, well, specifically of a New Orleans band, when they're playing counterpoint. We have these, rather than when you think about the kind of Count Basie swing sound, where I like to think of it like the way they swing together is like, it's like they're a shoal of fish and they all move together.
Yeah.
And that's a miraculous thing that kind of came together. Suddenly there was swing bands who could all agree on the same feel together.
Yeah.
And that's a very exciting and beautiful sound that kind of epitomizes the kind of mid-30s swing thing. But if you look at the beginning of the first recordings, and you look at, most famously Louis Armstrong, but also he came out of King Oliver. There's this other thing, and it's a beautiful thing, because you have all these different roles happening, and the clarinet style is very, very even. It's almost like if it was changed into I often think about the New Orleans horns as being like percussion instruments. The clarinet would almost be like a shaker part or something. It's very even, very solid. Sometimes almost feels like it's straight.
Yeah.
And the trombone might be a little bit more shuffly, but still like locking into the bass line. But the trumpet style, the cornet style, I should say, is all about disrupting and pushing. I like to think of it as creating flams in the music.
Right.
Flam to flam to flam flam flam. Like I can hear it as percussion.
Yeah.
So this is one side of it which is very exciting. It's like it's a pulling and pushing of the rhythm, which feels like still very groovy and very rhythmic. And we can we know that Billie Holiday kind of got. I think Billie Holiday sings like a New Orleans cornet player. She's taken, so that Louis Armstrong took his trumpet style, put it into the way he sang, and then his singing became very popular. And I think of Billie Holiday is influenced by that, and I think, but she took it to another level. You know, like really, how much can she pull this around, and it's this kind of interplay with kind of using it for expression in terms of emotion. You know, the dragging back for feeling, but also interplaying with the rhythm, and it's when it's kind of landing in a perfect kind of balance between those two things. That's when it's a very exciting thing, and I think. Yeah, it's really hard to explain exactly.
Yeah, someone tried to persuade me once that Billie Holiday just is singing in time all the time, and that it's easy to write her rhythms down. It's like sounds like the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard in my life. But I mean it's just so special how much she manipulates that idea of floating on top of something steady and then locking in exactly when she wants to, or never sometimes.
Well, she's always been my favourite. It's kind of strange to mention it. Well, maybe not. I mean, I had a brief period, you know, of getting into hip hop for a moment because of the same thing. It's that's basically when you've pared it right down. You haven't even got instruments anymore. You've just got the voice.
Yeah. You
haven't got any pitches, and it's just all about playing with that interplay between, you know, and so I got very excited by Roots Maneuver for the same reason that I get excited for Billie Holiday. This ability to create this feeling of slowing time down or pushing forward against the time, which only serves to add to the beat, to make the beat more exciting, to kind of actually make it feel.
Make it wider, doesn't it?
It makes it wider. It makes it more. So that's and I guess that's something that I feel. I mean, it is explored in modern jazz, of course it is, but it's just something, when it's done as an interaction with the dance floor, it has a different meaning to me. And I mean, I find it very exciting to kind of, I mean, that it all comes back to this word nuance. I don't know if we really used it fully, but nuance for me means all these things. It means how you sculpt the notes to make it sound like singing, how all the things that are kind of so subtle and so you know, in a micro kind of way.
Yeah.
That all part of the oral tradition of all music. And the reason why I listen to the really old stuff is because I feel I get a sense of these things. A lot of them I think may have been lost over time.
So we've spent the evening playing Wagner. And obviously I kind of chose you specifically to play this music because I knew you would play it better than pretty much anybody I can think of. But there are a lot of people who love classical music who love Wagner, who's like the most kind of despised and idolized figure in the whole of music probably. People who love classical music but they say they don't get jazz or they just don't like jazz. Like, what would you say to those people?
Well, I'd say maybe they should try listening to some of the older style jazz. Well, that's not really fair because I guess it's about taste. But I think when you do listen to the older jazz, quite often you're basically hearing the same music. It is actually the same music as classical music. It just might have a beat and some improvisation and some syncopation and the influence of the blues, but a lot of the time the melodies and the chord structures are just exactly the same music. It's
so what would you say to them to help them access it? Because obviously a lot of people like who don't know anything about jazz, they don't get or they can't work out that it's cyclical, that it cycles, you know. That's one thing I would say to people, like just think of it as something that repeats and that the melody is always there, for example. The melody is always there and all you have to do is just imagine the melody and it will help you understand and guide you through the music. But is there something else that you'd say to them, you know, because I've got so many friends who are like passionate about music but they just jazz, I don't get it.
Well, I'd say listen to Lester Young.
Yeah.
No, I mean, question just keeps drawing me back to why I like the old jazz, really.
That's fine.
I think it's I'm often trying to convince people with how I play and the music I choose to play of jazz. I've met a lot of people who don't like jazz.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy sometimes when I'm playing to be thinking like, well, how can I communicate to these sorts of people? And I have been lucky enough to meet people who said, well, we didn't think we liked jazz, but we like the stuff you're playing. We didn't think the stuff that you're playing, we didn't know what kind of music it was. We didn't know that it was jazz as such, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Then to someone else who claims that playing in this way, this old music, is sort of philosophically a bit dubious because it's old, even though like 90% of classical musicians play old music too, but let's not worry about those. What would you say to that person?
They think of old jazz as kind of like Tom and Jerry music and stuff. They think of like when you bend those notes around and you play all those kind of techniques, it's all just kind of silly kind of twee kind of comedy music, or they think it's...
Yeah.
I mean, it's not... I listen to it and I see it as something that's very deep, and basically it's a connection to the oral tradition of music going right back to the beginning of music. It's these things developed over time.
Yeah.
And
there's no reason why those things should be lost, right? I guess
so. I guess it's very hard to convince people though, because I think for a lot of people jazz is a different sort of thing, you know?
Yeah.
I had these arguments in college all the time, you know. I'd go and see a concert of modern jazz and I'd complain that it's like, well, I didn't really... the structure seemed very predictable. Here's this solo, then there's this solo, then this solo. And I couldn't see how it made sense as a piece as a whole.
Yeah.
And I said, well, for me, like, music follows the same principles as... all music, for me, follows the same sort of... it almost feels like a morality to me. It's like, you know, a piece of music should have a good sense of structure, you know, it should have a climax, it should have some sort of catchy, hooky thing somewhere.
Yeah.
And I was saying this to someone, and they were like saying, well, that's not what this music's about. And I think maybe that's why a lot of people are put off modern jazz, because I think a lot of people who play it don't feel that it should necessarily adhere to these things. You know, it shouldn't be music for just mere entertainment.
Yeah.
It's somehow there's something else. There's a different pursuit in modern jazz.
So do you think modern jazz, if we can call it that, or let's call it jazz post like the 40s more or less, do you think it's more democratic or less democratic in the way it's played?
Well, there's different ways of thinking about it. I've always found it a bit frustrating when you watch a concert where it's like a feeling that everybody has to be seen on an equal footing in terms of like the bass player shouldn't just be the guy in the back knocking out the bass notes, and the drummer, you know, everyone needs to get their say. That's a beautiful thing about that music, and that is, I suppose, one way of putting it. Saying that it's very democratic.
But at the same time, that's kind of very individualistic, in a way, isn't it? Because everyone kind of takes their turn in you know, not at the same time. They take their turn and then they stop, and a lot of the time when they stop, they don't even continue actively engaging with the music. They might listen to it, but they might also just leave the bandstand, like players playing their solo and then leaving the bandstand. And I mean, there are stories of like Coltrane going off stage and even practicing. Like, this stuff is like, I can't understand that kind of philosophy of music making.
Well,
whereas the older music, especially New Orleans music with all its like 5 parts in counterpoint, it's not exactly democratic, but it's much more communal, I think. You know?
Well, yeah, no, of course it's communal, and I suppose that's what I like about it. I like the idea that every single part of the whole has a different role, which adds to the whole in a very specific way. You know, like a good New Orleans band. You know, I'm very taken with the recordings of Armand J. Perron, who was a Creole musician from New Orleans, and his front line. He was a violinist. You know, he gives us a glimpse into what the New Orleans music sounded like.
So how was it organised?
Before, you know, so the point is that he was the leader. See, originally these bands were led by violin. You know, we had this kind of string band idea.
Yeah.
And we had the marching band idea, and these things came together along with the pianos. You know, these kind of 3 different worlds: the solo piano, the marching band, and the string band all came together, and certain things were kept and certain things were lost from each one, you know.
Yeah.
But what's kind of beautiful is the violin was always the leader of the string band, but
Yeah.
the trumpet's louder, so it makes much more sense to be the leader. But in Armand J. Perron, you still hear him taking the role of leader.
Yeah.
But the only way he can be heard is to play really high. So he plays the melody in the very top part of the violin,
Yeah.
and the trumpet, or the cornet, we should say, plays the melody an octave lower.
Yeah.
In a very different way, and in a syncopated way, in the way we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Playing with expressive rhythm, and then we have the clarinet player, doing this even rhythm, these kind of doing these obligato lines, painting all across and up and down the music.
Yeah.
And then there's the trombone, which is interacting with the bass line, in this kind of directing the chord changes, like decorating the cadences.
Yeah.
And then we have this most fascinating of all, and I wish I could remember the name, the alto saxophone in this band. He's sailing as close as he dares to the cornet, and there's this constant kind of, and sometimes he even's playing the same notes as so even already, like in 1923, we're hearing the sound of alto saxophone and trumpet playing in unison, which becomes the great sound of bebop. There are little moments of that, these two instruments that are so similar in sound, and kind of have this kind of dance. And it's and the amazing thing is that all these parts, they're all improvising at the same time.
Yeah.
And the only time we get solos is for these little 2-bar breaks, these little kind of moments.
Yeah, it's truly communal in that way. And I guess who knows about how people improvised polyphony like 400 years ago. It might have been incredible, but this music is like the most amazing example we know of improvised counterpoint for sure.
Well, it's because it follows it basically, it's basically two forms of counterpoint happening at once. That's the amazing thing about New Orleans music, about jazz. For some reason, and we can talk about that for hours, the drumming tradition does not survive. But the elements within West African drumming somehow have transferred into the horns. So we have, if we listen to the way the horns interplay, we can hear, so we talked about the cornet almost like being the solo drum in, marcating things and creating these, that's encapsulated in the horn. So there's this rhythmic counterpoint that's out of that tradition. At the same time, there's harmonic counterpoint, which comes out of the European tradition, and it's all perfectly fitting together.
So obviously, like learning all this music, I mean, what I would say is that you maybe it's old music, maybe it isn't. Who really cares about that? But for sure, you've learned all these incredible skills playing it, which are definitely applicable to playing any music. I would say, how to improvise counterpoint behind a melody, how to harmonize things, how to make beautiful sounds, extended techniques, micro intonation. All this stuff has nothing to do with swing specifically, does it? It's just skills, music skills.
I didn't mention before that I also have a great love for Ottoman music for other reasons which are actually relevant. The idea of blending in that music, the voice and all the instruments of orchestra play one line together, and they all try and collectively do sculpt that they bend the notes in exactly the same way. They hit these very almost impossibly small microtones all together. They're all playing together, and basically for me that comes back to the thing about rules, and like the more things the more rules of music the more freedom you actually have. It also comes to this other view that I have, and that basically, if there's anything that I love on a record, all I have to say to myself is that person's a human being too. Whatever it is they're doing, if they're doing it on a clarinet, I should be able to do it too. All I have to do is just listen very, very hard. Luckily I have modern technology. I can slow things down. If it's out of tune, I can put it in. I use technology too. But that's for me the most exciting thing. It's like there's just getting absolutely every single detail. Try and get inside what is that feel, what is that swing, how can I assimilate. Someone mentioned a very interesting phrase, I think I learnt it, this idea of assimilate, imitate, innovate, which I think is basically, that is the main should be the mantra of all jazz musicians actually. The idea is that first of all we're a mockingbird, and we just literally just try and the things that we love, we just, if you love it that much, then you just want to do it too, and you can do it too. It just takes a long time, a lot of dedication, and then you like think about, well, what is it that they're doing, and how can I kind of do the same sort of thing,
Yeah.
And then it's the very final stage is kind of this thing that's it's almost best when it's a subconscious thing, and that's the thing. Like, yes, at the moment I may have put myself out in the world as someone who's an obsessive kind of traditionalist, or I just but actually, I'm actually working on original music all the time. I'm composing stuff, and actually every time I go about practicing my improvisation, it's all about trying to find things I've never heard before.
Yeah.
And then there's been this thing that every time I do play new music with people, I have this great set of skills. If there's a melody going on, I'm able to improvise a counterpoint in various different ways, because I've studied all the different kinds of counterpoint that exist within this New Orleans counterpoint, which is quite what's the word?
Right.
It's quite a complete set of skills.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I've been really excited to play this project, because actually it's been really fun. It's been really fun to actually come back to some of the ideas about jazz that I learned before I kind of got obsessively into this old stuff. Thinking about the things I learned for playing free music. Finding, not always looking for the pristine and beautiful sounds in my instrument, looking for the more visceral and kind of extreme sounds as well.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to have them all in there, because kind of that's sort of how the world is.
I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? Again, where a lot of people struggle with modern with jazz as they hear it, is that sometimes it almost feels like there's a lot of harshness and not enough sweetness. And what I love, there's something, it might even just be the sound of those old records. They didn't have the ability to record all those high frequencies.
Yeah.
But it sounds softer in general. There's almost like an innocence, a kind of a sweetness, a cuteness, and you think, well, that some people would hear that and think, well, that's because they were kind of naive. It's kind of and they're kind of quick to say that it's somehow less deep.
Yeah, no, that's.
But actually, I think
bollocks,
I think the ability to make something bring you back to a feeling of innocence and childhood is actually the deepest thing you can possibly do. That's almost like what we're trying to do with music, is to give people relief, and the most beautiful feeling that there is how you felt when you were young and innocent. And
that's perfect place where we're gonna stop, because that's a really lovely thought. And so, thank you so much for your time and for talking to me and for playing this music today.
Pleasure. Nice one.